Less than 2% of venture capital funds go to women and minority-owned businesses. Yep, that's the hard fact and reality in the year 2023. Our guest is the founder and director of the Venture Capital Inclusion Lab at the Nelson Center for Entrepreneurship at Brown University. With funding from the Kauffman Foundation, she launched the lab to investigate why this abysmal under 2% number exists and to find ways to solve it. We're diving deep into the data pool today to learn what our guest and her team have uncovered and how this data may help improve the funding of under-resourced founders. Oh, get ready for a delicious conversation, everyone, on the Startup Life Show. Let's glow. Hello and welcome to the Startup Life Show. I'm your host, Ande Lyons, 4 times founder and startup champion to founders around the world. And after raising 4 businesses of my own, oh my gosh, what the heck? You guys are doing such unbelievable work every day, solving problems, managing high levels of uncertainty. Let me just get the clapper out and say, woohoo! I am cheering wildly for you, and I am in awe and wonder of your courage and your tenacity and your persistence and your conviction to get up every day and bring this dream of yours, this vision, this idea to reality through your startup. And I'm truly grateful that you carved out time to tune in to the Startup Life Show, because as you up your game as a founder, and through these conversations, you will definitely up your game, your startup will do better. And that's so important because there's no preparation really for this. You can go and get a degree in entrepreneurship, but until you launch your business, anyone will tell you when you land in the seat, that's when you really start learning about what the founder journey is about. If you're tuning in from YouTube, excuse me, please click on that subscribe button and definitely smash the like on there. That really helps us reach more people. If you're listening through the podcast, wherever you love to tune into podcasts, I'd be so grateful for you to subscribe, to like, to share, review, anything you feel called to do would really mean the world to us here at the Startup Live Show. And if you'd like to get a deep dive or just the links to all the podcasts, et cetera, whenever we have a new show, please hop on and join the Startup Life Meetup group. This way, you'll get an email after I've interviewed and posted the podcast and the video recording, and you can get a deep dive into the conversation with our wonderful guest. And for you B2B women-owned businesses, oh my gosh, if you haven't gotten WeBank certified yet, please jump on this. You're leaving money on the table. There are government and corporate contracts that want to do business with you. And this is the gold standard of certifications for women-owned businesses. Now, not only have I been a WeBank certified founder with my food manufacturing business, I have helped dozens of women who have startups with 0 revenue and just their first few months in business to those who have been in business for years, sometimes decades, and are 80 million and more. I've taken them across the finish line. So if you're sitting there going, I can't with this application, please reach out to me, Ande at andelyons.com, to find out how I can help you get WeBank certified. All right, so I'm so excited to introduce you to our amazing guest today. It's the one and only and a favorite in our New England startup ecosystem. It's Professor Banu Ozkazanc-Pan, and she's the founder and director of the Venture Capital Inclusion Lab at the Nelson Center for Entrepreneurship at Brown University. And the VC Inclusion Lab was started in 2018 with funds from Professor Banu's $260,000 Kauffman Foundation grant examining the decision-making and network behaviors of VCs. And today, the lab focuses efforts on understanding and solving funding inequities in the VC industry through data-driven research, education, and advocacy. Banu is also a professor of practice at the School of Engineering, and she's the academic director of the IE Brown University Executive MBA program. And her research interests are primarily in the areas of diversity and inclusion in organizations and in entrepreneurial ecosystems Oh boy, I'm just so excited for this great conversation and to introduce you to Professor Banu. Welcome to the show, Professor Banu. Woo-hoo!
Thank you, Andy. It's such an honor and pleasure to be here today and have a conversation with you and to reach your audience. I am so excited and humbled. So hello,
Oh,
everyone.
I am so grateful you're here. You know, one of my favorite stories was, I think it was like over 2 years ago when we were in the shutdown with the pandemic. And I had a wonderful gentleman out of Johannesburg on the show, Sylvester Myer. And you were like, you reached out to him and said, hey, usually we like to go to Johannesburg, but this year we can't. So, you know, could you talk to my students? And I just thought that was so cool of you, Professor Banu.
Thank you, Andy. And Sylvester is amazing. He was so kind and generous with his time and sharing his expertise with the executive MBA students who, unfortunately, because of the pandemic, couldn't travel to South Africa. So he brought South Africa to us, shared his, startup journey, the challenges, tribulations, and trials that any entrepreneurs face, but especially in the context that he's in. So it was wonderful to learn from him. And we were lucky enough this year to go back to South Africa and learn in person. So,
oh my gosh, what a wonderful experience. And why do you focus on South Africa with your students?
So it's an interesting and unique experience. Most executive MBA programs don't have such an experiential and residential journey attached to their learnings and programs, but we feel that entrepreneurship is worthy of studying anywhere in the world. And South Africa, especially Cape Town, gives us insights into what it's like to try to be a founder in a post-apartheid country where resources are scattered and only available to certain people, yet you have these unbelievable founders from whom we learn so much as we share some of our business expertise with them. So it's an unbelievably humbling journey where our business entrepreneurs and leaders learn from the founders on the ground.
You know, I love that something fierce. I actually got goosebumps as you told that story, because here in America, sometimes we forget how open this country is to commerce and launching a business, right? And going into other countries and seeing how hard it is through permitting alone sometimes can, you know, prevent you from launching a business, but then to also see what are the resources others are using. I love that you take your students into that type of deep dive in a country that's far away from Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island.
It's definitely humbling and we learn so much.
I love that. So let's go back. I believe it's since 2008 you've been educating folks in the entrepreneurial space, and I'm wondering why. What compelled you to focus your deep education in research and business on the entrepreneurial landscape? Like, what lights you up about this?
Yeah, we have to kind of roll back all the way to me doing my PhD
Okay.
dissertation. I am originally from Turkey. I was raised in different parts of the world, which I'm happy to expand upon. But when I was doing my research, I was very much interested in founders in the tech space. So I ended up going to Palo Alto, Silicon Valley, and talking to founders and entrepreneurs who had businesses that allowed them to travel between the US and Turkey. And in doing that, it was really eye-opening to understand what it takes to really be a founder, and all the policies that need to be in place, the good policies around immigration, tech, startups, ecosystem, inclusive issues around what do we do to make sure resources are available to everyone. So it was really this, engagement with founders, interviewing them, observing them, that really led me to say, okay, here's the academic piece that I can write, but there must be something I can support and do in terms of having something applied, right? It felt odd and somewhat unethical to only write about them, but not do anything to maybe help them. So it was
Oh,
that sort of lens of here's what I wrote and here's what I maybe can do to help you.
I love that. An action plan. Because
Yeah.
it's one thing to theorize and to analyze on a paper and talk about it as if it's under a microscope and you're in the lab and showing the results of your research, but then to be able to say, and here's how I can help in my own way shift this paradigm. And you mentioned a really important word, which is policies. Some
Yeah.
people tend to think that the law in our country is only for taking someone to court over some civil or criminal lawsuit. And really, our court system is wonderful for creating policies, for taking moments to get down into the government, the representatives, the House, the Congress, and say, hey, what can we do to intrinsically change the culture around this, right?
Absolutely. And it's so interesting, this weekend was graduation at Brown, and one of the recipients of the honorary doctorate degree was Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo, who, of course, was the governor of Rhode Island. And she is, as the Commerce Secretary, really, blazing a path forward and trying to make sure that the innovation economy in the U.S. is incredibly robust and inclusive. And that's a first. That's a first, policy that's come out that really understands the value of inclusion in the innovation ecosystem and the role that founders of all types play.
I have to tell you, we are huge fans here, folks, of Gina, because we knew her as the governor of Rhode Island. And what a fierce force and what excellent representation of a woman in a powerful position who knows how to get things done, right?
Yeah.
Professor Banu, what was your experience of her?
It was unbelievable. It was really wonderful to hear her talk, and now to have this next platform to really scale up her priorities around innovation and inclusion. So it was really inspiring. And as governor, she did so much. And now to see what she can do with the new sort of scaled up platform she has as the Commerce Secretary, it was really inspiring.
It's so exciting for this country and for entrepreneurship. And I'm always saying, Professor Banu, how entrepreneurship is the best personal development program out there. And because you tap into sources and resources about yourself, folks, that no other profession could really help you tap into. How has this deep dive into learning about entrepreneurs, both in America as well as internationally, and teaching entrepreneurship, how has this impacted you? How have you evolved as a person as well as a professional in your professional experience?
A couple of things. One might surprise you. You didn't know this about me, I don't think. The first one I would say, when you teach entrepreneurship, you yourself become involved in sort of changing mindsets of what becomes possible when you first thought it was impossible. So you really learn to have a much more entrepreneurial mindset and to look and seize opportunities that you might not have before. So it really changes the idea that you have to become a founder to know you can be entrepreneurial. Even if you end up in an organization, you could be an entrepreneurial leader. And I try to embody that within the institution of higher education. Can we create new opportunities and spaces for students and ideas that maybe aren't there prior? Second, in my research, I try to make sure that the work that I do also benefits the people who are giving me their time and wisdom. And for me, over the years, that's really shaped into applied research and work rather than simply staying in the text. And I think I've sort of taken that on as an ethical and entrepreneurial endeavor. And then the third one, during the pandemic, I actually co-founded a dog treat company with my husband.
Now you are in it. Oh my God, you're looking at margins, you're looking at inventory, you're managing a lot.
And I went through the WBDC here in Connecticut with Fran Pastore and her amazing crew to learn about sort of what is it like to be a woman in business, because that's what I am. I'm selling a dog treat, which is a very feminized industry, and all the barriers that exist, ranging from getting licensed to startup costs to also seeing how women support each other. All the stores that I'm actually in 4 stores, are women owned, and they have been terrific. So the things that I'm doing are like, well, I'm studying it, I'm applying it, and I'm doing it.
Oh, this is wonderful news. Congratulations. So what's the name of your dog treat business?
It's called Derpy Doggy.
Derpy, how do you spell that?
Derpy. So Derpy is like a silly, goofy looking dog, which both my dogs are. And they're Icelandic sheepdogs. They're on my label. So it's derpydoggy.com for those of you who have doggies.
And is it DOGGY?
DOGGY.
Okay. Folks, I'm going to have that link in the show notes because we want to support Professor Banu, just like we support all the founders on the show with her business. But I love that because I'm sure it's just taking you to a whole new level of what a founder goes through as they figure things out that they didn't even know. And I spoke with a woman recently who headed up, I think, like Pepsi Cola's $1 billion, revenue channel, right? I mean, she has been in it for 30 years. This is practically, a CMO who understood CPG big time, running tons of parts and pieces and details. And she said, launching her business 3 years ago was the hardest thing she's ever done and made it look like a breeze. Yes, of course, when you have the resources and talent at your disposal of a large corporation, it helps in the assets, but still, there's just nothing better than diving into the seat. So congratulations, Professor Banu.
Well, I appreciate that. And you are right. It is nothing like the studying of it, the doing of it.
So good. And, I have a great TikTok and IG reel out there and short on YouTube called, you always win when you launch a business, no matter what happens, because if it fails, which startups do all the time, you'll launch another business because most founders have another idea in the queue, or you'll take those skills and, as you were talking about, transfer them to your next gig with corporate. You're going to be more valuable, you're going to get paid more, and you're going to be able to bring that entrepreneurship, innovation to your next gig. What do you think about that, Professor Banu?
I think that is absolutely right. And I've seen it both in my life, but also in the students who go through some of the entrepreneurship programs we have at Brown. They may not all end up as founders right after graduation, but 2, 3, 5 years out, they're all doing something that's in the leadership, that's in the startup. So these skills are really, really important to have.
Absolutely. And of course, you become more valuable because you have more self-knowledge as well for managing that. And I think too, I just want to remind founders, since we're talking about this, that one of the best statisticians out there, Adam Grant, in his book, Outliers, he came up with the stat that says, I think it's 32% of the founders that launch a side hustle. Let me rephrase that. Side hustles have a 32+% greater chance of success than those folks who just quit their job and start a business. So I just want to throw that out there because those who are thinking about entrepreneurship and sitting on the fence, I really encourage you to just do it, but you don't have to jump off what you're doing now. You can do a side hustle. Many employers are okay with that. And you can figure out all the details and make sure you can still pay rent and feed your family.
Those are so true.
So let's talk about equity and inclusion, because a lot of people can study entrepreneurship and really not care about equity and inclusion and ageism and all the things that go into what equity and inclusion looks like. Why has this become a guiding light for you?
So I'm going to go back to my dissertation research, and it was really interesting to me as I was speaking to these tech founders who were sort of traversing the globe with their startup. At some point, I realized that I was really just interviewing at that time 30-year-old men. And that, this was in the early 2000s. So being young meant 30. Now it's like you could be in your 20s or early, teenager, essentially. You could be a founder. And it was really eye-opening to realize that there were very little to no women that I was being exposed to and talking to tech founders. And when I would show up to events, they would assume I was someone's partner, secretary, assistant, and kind of show me to that side of the room. And as a social scientist, this was profoundly interesting, but also incredibly frustrating. And so my sense was, where are all the women? What's happening? And that really led me to sort of the next decade or so of my research.
Yeah, welcome to our world here, folks. I mean, and those listening to the podcast, my eyes were rolling on all of that, right? It not only has it been prevalent for decades, and the women are out there. The women have been quietly going along, creating incredible businesses, soaring and taking some IPO, et cetera, but they just haven't been in the limelight. Same with our Black and brown people, our disabled, and our members from the LGBTQ plus community. And I was interviewed when I had a .com in 98 through 2000, and I was interviewed by Wired magazine. And I said, look, there's no way this culture could ever be sustainable. You're talking about young men who are sleeping on the couch in their office, who can work 24/7 on their .com and have nothing else going on in their life. Many people have beloveds. They're raising children. They have other interests. This is not sustainable. And no, there were very few women that I could see in my realm as well as founders, certainly some throwing money in. And so this is so important. And it's become glaringly obvious as we start to dive deep into the numbers, Professor Banu, as we get going over into the venture capital and, of course, private equity too, folks. They have their own challenges. But why did you focus your equity and inclusion lens on the VC industry? And why did you go deeper into this investigation by applying for the grant with the Kauffman?
So it took me some time to understand the phenomenon of why is it in the tech space, particularly, there are so few women founders, and when there are, why are so few of them venture backed? So it was sort of spending literally years understanding the phenomenon, what's been done to understand and investigate it, what are some of the proposed solutions, and then there was a great opportunity from the Kauffman Foundation, applied, got a grant with a co-PI, and we were really interested in how resources and money specifically were allocated in specific ecosystems to understand what are the mechanisms through which money gets dispersed to founders, and what are those drivers of inclusion and exclusion. So we sort of really identified the problem at the level of venture capitalists deciding that among all the venture backable founders, they're just going to keep choosing the white males. And this as a phenomenon is really interesting given white males are about 30% of the population. They're overrepresented in venture capital as investors and as founders. So the social scientist in me is okay, why does this keep happening?
And that's a very good question to be asking. Why does this keep happening? And why is this the filter with which these decisions are being made? We understand herd mentality. As a social scientist, you understand proven track records. But I know from my own studies, from having graduated with my MBA from the only all-women MBA program, we dove deep into the indoctrination and how to manage the bias. But I'm thinking myself that there's so much indoctrination for thousands of years that women are not risk takers. Women cannot be trusted. And we have the same thing with Black and brown folks or members of the LGBTQ plus, and even the most enlightened of our wonderful men in the world are having to sort of dissolve this almost lizard response in their brain to the, I don't know if I can trust, or they're really not risk takers. That's just there intrinsically in their brain. Can you speak to that, Professor Banu?
Yeah, I can, sadly. And so one of the things that I did with a colleague, Susan Clark-Montaigne, is we wrote a book on a gender perspective on entrepreneurial ecosystems, really looking at the multi-layered and leveled reasons why we continue to see the inequities. And one, at the individual level, at the level of decision-making, there's this sort of holding back around and assumptions that really guide the behavior of investors to associate riskiness with women and risk taker as a positive for men. So the idea of risk becomes negative when it's associated with women, but much more positive when it's associated with men. At the organizational level, so the level of the venture capital firm, a lot of times we know that women tend to invest in other women more frequently than men. And so one of the ways we can think about making sure that more female and other folks get funded is to have investors be much more diverse. And for the longest time, the VC industry only operated by word of mouth in terms of having job openings and investors having sort of an opportunity for partners to come in. So when you look at the composition of the VC firm, we also see that there's a lot of homogeneity, not a lot of diversity in the decision-making levels. And then lastly, institutions. So institutions are formal and informal rules of the game. So we know that a lot of the informal rules of the game sort of still are guided by gender stereotypes and gender norms around the capabilities and roles that women should occupy in society. So the individual, organizational, institutional are continuously layered on top of each other. Sometimes you'll hear this referred to as an intersectional analysis, where you're bringing an understanding of the social, the cultural, and the political together to understand, why is our society and economy the way it is? And so it's a very wicked problem, as we say in the New England area. It's entrenched, it's embedded, and it's interrelated. And so the solutions have to acknowledge that it's not just about women pitching better or differently. This is systemic.
Yeah, and one of my theories that I love to put out there with absolutely no data to back it up is I say, okay, follow the money, go up the river. Who's investing in these funds?
Yeah.
How do we get women or super women friendly men in these big institutional funds? I mean, folks, they are out there. They're running the teachers' pensions. They're running, hedge funds are for real, and everything they're doing. They have a lot of power with where they're investing their money, and they invest into these VC funds. The VCs work very hard to get their money. I would like to see these folks in these positions of power, Professor Banu, charge the VC funds by saying, okay, I'm going to give you $100 million for your fund, of which I am specifically saying 50% of this needs to go to women-owned businesses. And I'm not talking about, you're going to hear pitches from these women. I am asking that this money is earmarked and earmarked only for investment in. If you're going to lose 10 million on a company, it's got to be this woman and funded. And I just feel like that's the only way it's going to change with that, or we take them to court. But please talk about that theory of mine with nothing to back
You
it
are
up.
so right. So it's the LPs, the endowments, the pensions, the family offices, sovereign wealth, you name it, the people who have sort of these big pockets and buckets of money to allocate. We are seeing actually some movement on the part of LPs that are now asking VCs, what does your portfolio look like? What are the percentages of money you're allocating to these different types of founders? The Institutional Limited Partner Associations, ILPA, has some nice guidelines around making sure that we are investing diversely or in diverse sort of portfolios via VCs and GPs. The real sort of sticky point here is when you are an emerging fund manager and you're raising fund 1 or 2, there's not a lot of LPs that are willing to take that risk on you, because what we know from LPs who will tell you when you're not recording them and it's off the books is that they feel a very much liable, and that their reputation is on the line if they make an investment in an emerging fund manager who happens to be not white or woman or anyone from sort of an underserved community, that if the returns are not great, then the likelihood of them sort of having a risk associated with their job is pretty high. So there's a real personal reputation issue here of people wanting to do the right thing but feeling like it's so much easier to invest in fund 3, 4, 5.
Professor Banu, I call BS on that one. And here's why. Because I see, all the big companies that have gone under. I mean, Quibi, for example, for crying out loud, raised over $1 billion and it went under very quickly. And, that, and so many others. We saw WeWork, and they're throwing all this money after him. I also, before I became unemployable in 1992 and started my entrepreneurship world, I went right from my MBA into banking. Not that it was a fit, but because I wanted to do financial analysis on every industry. And I had a portfolio filled with a lot of private banking type of customers, including the VC. So since 1990, I have been entrenched in the VC world. And I knew that and I've helped raise money, not just for my own companies, but for others. And so I know the inside game, which is they want to have one or two hits that's going to give them that return on their big fund, and then they can go and raise from 50 million to 100 million. The track record's out there, but they really are very comfortable writing that check for 10 million. And I know that very comfortable is relative, for a company that they think really has a good chance to make it. But if it doesn't, it was a good try. So they're not comfortable with the emerging funds. And so, and I'm bringing this up, Professor Banu, because the people who tune into the Startup Life show know that we're always putting the fundraising under a microscope. And so, and we know that there's some wonderful emerging funds out there. They just can't close, right? They've got a 10 million, even 100 million fund. They're trying, and they've got, even if those with traction are having a hard time getting the money, even though they're firmly entrenched. They have community. They've done all the right things. They are great at discerning themselves who is investable, right? And still can't get the money from the LPs. I know. Let me get off my soapbox.
You're absolutely right. It's, the data shows us that what they perceive to be the case is not true. Yet they still have these mindsets of, it's too much of a risk. My personal reputation and potentially job is on the line, so I'm not going to do it. If I lose money in the next WeWork, that's acceptable. But I'm not going to do it in an emerging fund manager, which is really, really, really a shame.
And, this is something that I know that you're working hard on at the Venture Capital Inclusion Lab, which is to really understand, and you've done that, the numbers as to why. And this is, as a social scientist, this must just be like, ooh, right? You must be lighting up everywhere because you're seeing it from that angle, yes?
Yeah, so one of the things we're working on right now is putting together, I would say, a white paper that's based on research over the several years, looking at sort of these new models, new and emergent ways in which those folks who are in VC but are trying to do things differently, rather than the soft banks who are saying, here's the side pocket of money, we are seeing new models. So, I'm talking to people who are building relationships with community and in a very much private equity kind of model, kind of doing the wraparound and growing with them and then investing in them rather than sort of being transactional. It's quite long term. We're seeing new models of assessing risk and thinking about due diligence. And I'll get to talking about it today because I think Allison had a question of like,
I do. I'm just about to read that. And folks, you know how much I love Scroobious, right? Please visit Scroobious. It's a human-first fundraising experience. It's founder peer support. You get everything, but most importantly, how to pitch to investors. And with their new platform, Scroobious also is democratizing the private equity world by making it accessible for investors to come in and kick the tires of incredible founders like you who are in the Scroobious database. So please visit Scroobious, SCROOBIOUS.com, Scroobious.com, and put promo code Ande15 to receive 15% off first tier pricing when using the promo code. So it's a phenomenal platform, everyone, to help prepare you for raising capital for your business. That's the bottom line. And she has this great question for you. Can you give an example, Professor Banu, of something that has been done in response to research that has made a demonstrable difference in funding overlooked entrepreneurs?
Thank you. Yes, I can. So thank you, Allison. The good folks at Village Capital actually have a framework, and they've done randomized controlled trials, field experiments to kind of demonstrate the positive benefits. And as simple as it sounds, a lot of VCs and investors actually don't have a robust framework for evaluating the founders and companies that come to them. And because of that, they tend to overemphasize issues of risk when they're speaking to female founders and overemphasize potential for growth when they speak to male founders. So one of the solutions is, prior to speaking with any founder, to have a framework where you are deciding what the evaluation criteria is. What are the percentage points that you're going to allocate to risk, to growth, and what are those areas where you're going to see how a company can improve based on feedback. So one, have a robust evaluation criteria with weighted ways in which you're going to assess each company in the same way, asking them the same question. And then the second area is really around thinking through, rather than assuming that a company can improve if they're given feedback, to give them concrete feedback and then see them again in a few months to see how they've used that feedback to make changes, and then evaluate the company. So use data to make much more robust decisions. And when Village Capital implemented this plan, they actually saw that women who got sort of these positive responses would move on to pitch in front of more investors over time. So that gave women confidence because they were getting positive feedback and getting investment. And men were sort of becoming mediocre, which is natural. So rather than being given a benefit, an unearned benefit related to their gender, they were sort of coming down to being mediocre, because when you evaluate everyone in the same way, you can see where people line up.
That's right. And women shine, folks. The data is there, right, Professor Banu?
Absolutely, they do. And so on the one hand, while we assume women are more risky, that's actually not true. Women are risk smart, and they will take the money that they're given and actually scale much more efficiently than men.
See, I'm telling you, folks. So what I'm hearing from the Village study then is that they went to the VCs and helped or they gathered data from venture capital firms that were actually having a robust discernment of female founders, and also provided the right feedback to them.
So they have a framework called ABACA. It's on Village Capital's website. And what this framework allows people to do is to come to an understanding of, like, if you and I are evaluating a company, I might think they're at one stage, whereas you might think they're at another stage. This allows us to come to some sort of shared understanding. And by having a robust framework that me and you are using, we're looking and asking at the same time at the same thing. So we're not sort of off from each other. Yeah. And I'm not going with my gut and saying, I really like this person. I mean, I think they're going to be a winner. I'm looking at my numbers and saying, we agreed to this evaluation criteria. We agreed to weight, risk, and growth in these ways. And our numbers tell us we should invest in this team and not the other one, no matter how much you like them.
And this is very fascinating, because I had the founder of UNEST on the show, and that's a wonderful, I'm showing it on the screen for podcast listeners, and it's a wonderful investment platform for parents to save for their kids, whether it's college or just to get on in life, right? And have some capital under their belt when they leave home. And she just she knew as a fintech founder that she couldn't rely on herself to raise the money. She knew the bias was there. And even though she's 10 years in the financial services industry, incredible founder and very resourced person. So she built up an advisory team of luminaries, and she worked hard to get them. But when she walked into the room, it was like the Avengers standing behind her, men that were unquestionably white, talented, and would fit any VC's preference. So she raised $38 million in a 2-year period to launch her platform. I have a vision of the world that doesn't have to happen. That female founder has the right kind of traction, just like another white guy, although I've seen plenty of white guys get funding on the actual back of a napkin. So, but she shows up, she gets it. I'd love to know from you, as you continue to evaluate the data that you're gathering and, looking at the lack of equity and funding, overlooked entrepreneurs, where do you see things going over the next 5 years? And along with the wonderful data that the Village Capital platform and fund found, what are other specific strategies you believe are going to create change? And there's an add-on question here. what are some legal actions perhaps that can be taken to compel VCs to start walking the talk?
Those are great questions. I can share with you what I think might happen. I don't know if I'm right.
That's
But
okay.
one of the things that's interesting is we can put in robust practices and processes, which is what the Village Capital Framework does. But it's a lot more difficult to change mindset. So I'll give you an example. I'm working with a VC firm that, on the one hand, very much is interested in investing in a diverse portfolio of founders. But on the other hand, when I speak to them, the mindset is we want to invest in risk takers, disruptors, and visionaries. And those are highly gendered ideas around founders. And so you need to make sure that the mindset changes alongside with the practices and processes, because otherwise in 5 years, we're just slowly going to be doing most of the same thing. So one of the things that needs to change is the mindset. And I think the hope that I have is we're becoming increasingly much more diverse as a society. The folks that are becoming founders and investors are really changing, I think, the demographic makeup of the industry. So I have hope in that. They're going to be reaching new markets, new communities, new products and services are going to be venture backable. The other thing that I'm also seeing is there are new models for thinking about policies that could be helpful to making sure that the funding of founders who look more like the demographics that we're in rather than sort of a skewed version of it are related to setting up federal and state funds that could invest with matching amounts of money from private entities to make sure that we're funding founders, parts of the country like the Midwest, where we often don't see a lot of venture-backed money. The American Center for Entrepreneurship in DC advocates for a lot of policies in a bipartisan way to create opportunities with funding from state and federal government entities to sort of launch that next, iteration of the innovation economy. And lastly, I'm seeing a lot of shifts, at least under this administration, where inclusion is seen as an important competitive advantage in the innovation economy. And so we have unbelievable legislation coming out in the form of the CHIPS and Science Act, the Build Back Better, the Good Jobs Act, lots of policy and legislation that's coming out that I think will support much more inclusive innovation economy. And so if you're a VC and you want to be ahead, it would make sense for you to invest in these founders that have yet to get their fair share of funding.
I'm very excited about that, Professor Banu. I really am, because I'm a firm believer policies and laws are the way to make these changes happen. And, and listeners and viewers, you have to know it's all I can do when I see one more white male from the VC industry talk about how inclusion is so important and we're going to diversify. And I just really, and everybody's like, oh, we love you in the comment section because everybody wants their money. And I want to be the one that calls BS and just says, no, you don't, or you be doing it. So stop it. Stop it right now.
True, Andy. A few years ago, when I was interviewing VCs in the Boston ecosystem for our book that came out a couple of years ago, The Gender Perspective on Ecosystems, I remember him very clearly telling me, we don't need specific or dedicated funds for women or any other type of founder because a rising tide lifts all boats. And all I wanted to tell him was, not everybody has a darn boat, right? So, when you're starting from a very different place, a rising tide will just as might drown you as
right,
you.
Exactly.
And so now this person is actually one of the biggest advocates of women-focused funds. So a lot has shifted since then. We had Me Too, we had Black Lives Matter, we had these civil and civic movements. And I think while there's been a change in some of the conversation, the funding actually has gotten somewhat worse.
Yeah. Well, we just went down a few points over the last year. What I'm looking for as well, I interviewed Pascal from, oh my gosh, folks, it was late summer, I think, a phenomenal VC out of a great investment firm. Its name is escaping me right now. But when two things happened when they brought her on board. One, they gave her check writing capability immediately. And when she was balking at being a board member on a startups fund, they said, no, 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 you have to own your check writing as well. You need to be on the board. They gave her so much power. It was delicious to see. And she doesn't have the traditional startup ecosystem, VC world background. So that's one thing I'd like to see more of, Professor Banu. And I'd like to see less of the, with all due respect to our Ivy League schools, Brown, Dartmouth, Harvard, Yale, et cetera, Williams College, but I'd like to see less of these associates being brought on. I know they're smart. I know they've got great stats minds and math minds, et cetera. But when they go to interview and do the initial conversations with a founder, it really feels like they're in a completely different world, that they do not understand what it's like to be a diverse founder, not just raising capital, but building and scaling a business. And it just feels like, come on, get more, quote, people who look like those founders that you're investing in. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, and I think there really is a push to diversify the investor pool, not from sort of the networks of your alumni. Stanford always tops the list. And you know, we ran some research with the VC Inclusion Lab looking at PitchBook and TechCrunch data, or Crunchbase data. And so women and men who graduate from the same, you know, top university, Stanford, let's say, they actually end up getting different amounts of money, with women getting less. So even at that level, even if you were to bring in someone from Stanford, the woman founder would still make less. So education and alumni networks really benefit men. So if we want to change the math, we have to change how we're recruiting, hiring, investing, all of it. You know, as an industry, it's still informal in the way that we don't have hiring managers like we do in more established organizations. Yeah. If you're overlooked, you can't go complain to your HR manager. So a lot of it's so informal that you can kind of get away still with, you know, hiring from networks, your associates, you know, and bringing in the people that you know that have connections to other people that you know. So
legacy hires is what I like to call them. I know your dad. You know, he and I went to cool school together. Folks, I'm having an Andy-licious moment because I want to hold this vision in my heart for a second, which is that the equity and inclusion really shifts in the VC industry, and that our emerging funds get the funds they need in order to do the work you know that they will do. They are diverse, they are inclusive, and they will fund phenomenal, and they are funding phenomenal companies. They just need bigger money, because 25,000 bucks is great, 50 is great. For 5 million, that's how you scale. That's how you go deep into enterprise and start rocking the returns big time with that kind of money. You have, I think I noticed that you have your newest research project, and why you're diving into this landscape of global entrepreneurship and innovation. Did I read that correctly?
You did. So this is actually my fifth book, but my second one with Cambridge. So the first one looked at gender. This is looking at sort of global aspects of innovation. One of the things that's always been interesting for me, I am originally from Turkey. I grew up in Saudi Arabia. I went to high school in Switzerland. I came to the US. All throughout my life, there have been spaces and places where I have been welcome or not. And I thought, you know, after really doing a deep dive with sort of focused on gender, what do these global innovation dynamics look like? You know, as cities are competing with each other globally to be the next hub of innovation, what are they doing? And are they building something that maybe we can all learn from in terms of inclusion? So the global perspective is really trying to look at these different ways in which different cities are building innovation ecosystems, sometimes very much from the top down, with intention in particular niche industries, to understand what are they doing, and what can we possibly learn, particularly in terms of innovation.
Yeah, we had a wonderful gentleman from Singapore who spoke about their support of the startup ecosystem. If you ever want some connections for that, phenomenal. And the actual traction and results from investing in their startup ecosystem there. It's just remarkable. I loved every minute learning about that. So, Professor Banu, as you move forward with all of your incredible work in this area, what does success look like for you? You touched on it, like what it looks like in a few years, but ideally, what's that real wow? For me, and the Inclusion Lab, the Venture Capital Inclusion Lab, as we impact this world, what does success look like for you?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think for me, it would be lovely not to have to say gender in entrepreneurship or race in entrepreneurship. There's a history there. I think we need to honor the history of why certain people have been left out. But at the same time, we are still not at the point where we can, mainstream gender and race and any other sort of different into talking about venture capital, talking about entrepreneurship and innovation. It would be nice to feel that those of us who constantly talk and do this work are also supported by male allies, white male allies, who also feel that this is their responsibility. When we're not in the room, that they're speaking up about these issues so that it's not always us talking to us about issues.
And being like, oh, there she is, another angry woman. No.
Absolutely.
I love that. And for the VC Inclusion Lab, do you see this continuing, or will you get more funding? What does that future look like?
Yeah, it's a great question. So funding is always helpful, but I am very lucky to be in the Nelson Center for Entrepreneurship, where I have folks who are helping me, whether it's students, undergraduate or graduate, or supportive staff. Next iteration is really trying to move into the world of policy and implementation. So creating policies that are impactful and effective is great, but also understanding, what are the pitfalls when you come to implementation. And that's where I think the VC Inclusion Lab can have a big role to play in talking about, what are those effective ways in which you take a policy and implement it in ways that are sort of true to its goals rather than not. And that comes from my training as an organizational, studies, social scientist, to say at some point you become a grown-up organization. You need to implement things. This is what they need to look like.
That's correct. And I love that, something fierce, and getting the leaders of those big funds, the managing founders, who sit on their thrones. No, I didn't say that. I'm sorry. Who sit there and wave their hands. Anyway, I just love all of this. I love your work. Folks, you've got to visit the VCinclusion.com to learn more, connect with Professor Banu on LinkedIn, and learn more about her remarkable work and follow her everywhere she goes. The links will be in the show notes. Any last words for folks as I wrap up and pop you into the green room?
I am just delighted to be here. I am very happy to connect with everyone and anyone, to support you, to cheer you on, to connect you with anyone who might be in my world. And also know that what you're doing is really hard. It's not easy by any measure. And I am really, really here to help you in any way that I can and just cheer you on. And thank you for amplifying this work, Ande. I am a big fan of your work, and I'm just honored to be on this platform with you and your community.
And Professor Banu, you and I are going to find a way to hurl, hang out in real life, hug in real life. I'm really looking forward to that moment. And it's just been pure joy to have you in my circle as well, and in our ecosystem, and seeing and watching you and the lab and also your work at Brown University and entrepreneurship have such an impact on folks' lives globally as well as locally here. So thank you so much for joining me. Stick around for a second. I'm just going to wrap up the show. Folks, I know that you've been curious about this world of VC and you wanted to hear the data from the one and only Professor Banu. Again, please link in with her. Get connected to what she's doing. It's so important. If you have anybody you think she should chat with as well, do that. change will happen. And I believe that Professor Banu and the folks at VC Inclusion Lab are on their way to making it happen. In the meantime, I am so grateful that you tuned in. And I promise, I just need you to promise me just a little thing right now, okay? Please remember, you're braver than you believe. You're stronger than you seem. And as we say here in Boston, you're wicked smarter than you think. Oh my gosh. I am cheering wildly for you. And I know you've got this. Until we chat next time, be sure to join the Startup Life Meetup group and reach out to me anytime on social. I'm here for you. Okay. Wishing you a delicious day everywhere you glow. Mwah, everyone.